I think many foresters in communicating with the public about what we're doing don't really fully understand the context and why forests as an issue are so emotional to most people. And when we think about it, it's really a links back to this human nature relationship, and that we have in the places we live, the cities and urban areas, we literally have given up the idea of having nature there for the most part. And the other place that we sacrifice the landscape is in agricultural areas. Everybody understands eating, and in our minds, we have sacrificed nature because we want to displace that for food production. We all understand that. So, where does that leave nature? It leaves nature and the human relationship to it in forests. And so the controversy around forest practices and the court cases and the regulations and whatnot, I think, come back to this deep gut level understanding and appreciation and desire for nature. And we as foresters have sort of been by default made the curators of nature. And people feel a lack of nature, and so they're trying to get the forest to be that place. And that idea, that human nature conflicts, ends up on the forested landscape and all of the things that we're talking about here today.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Kristoff. On this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. And today's episode is a long one, if you didn't notice, but it is a good one, to say the least. Before we start this episode, I wanted to pay tribute to a true titan of forest sustainability that we lost a couple weeks ago. This gentleman has touched the lives of so many people and was responsible for so much of the good things in the forest professional world and in, environmental sciences in general. Peter J. Murphy passed away a couple weeks ago, and he was a true role model. One of the most passionate, empathetic, and thoughtful people that I've ever met in this industry. And we would not be where we are today without him. I really looked up to him. I really still do look up to him. And we need more people like him. He's done so much for the sustainability of our forests that he's really a person that everyone should know about. So, thanks a lot, Peter. We couldn't have done this without you. You're an incredible role model to everybody. And I feel so grateful to have been able to record with you a couple times and to suss out your thoughts about sustainability and the environment and the importance of nature in our lives. So thank you so much, Peter. You will be remembered. Today's episode, I was fortunate enough to bring on three gentlemen two from the States and one from Canada, from Alberta here, and all three of which are very highly regarded in their field. And they really, big picture folks who are willing to think about the way we do things and whether or not we need to change them. And I wanted to have a conversation about the future of sustainable forest management. So what do we want the forests of the future to look like? What values do we want to manage for? And how do we want to go about doing that? And we ended up having a conversation about values and about differing values and about communicating those values, trying to figure out how we can make sure that all of the values that the forest provides are available to everybody forever, right? And it was a really cool, intriguing conversation about how do we engage the public? How do we get, foresters thinking a certain way about how to do this? How do we ensure that all aspects of the forest are included in forest management and will remain there forever? It was a really incredible conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. And, listen to it in segments if you have to, but it was great. Sponsors for this week, the same as always. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2020. Without them, this would not be possible. And I cannot say thank you enough to them for supporting the podcast. It allows me to do a lot of cool things that I wouldn't be able to do without it. So thank you, West Fraser. And secondary sponsors, Greenlink Forestry has been with me since the beginning, and I couldn't have done this without them. Again, thank you, Greenlink, for all the good work you do in the industry and for helping me out. And the final sponsor is Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is a company out of Edmonton, and now their staple product is selling more damaged timber. He's going out into the bush, cutting down wildfire, burnt wood, and turning that into stuff you can put in your kitchen. Butcher boards, charcuterie boards, super cool. Check him out, damagedtimber.com. Your Forest 10 at checkout to get 10% off. And without any further messing around, let's dive into this bad boy, learn about the future of sustainable forest management and how we can engage the public a little better. Here we go. Thinking about this whole idea of sustainable forest management in the future, right, and comparing it to how we're doing it today, the whole concept is that we're going to be sustainable for all values forever, right? That's where this all came from. And so thinking about this, I was thinking about how we define sustainability, right? And I was using the idea of the thin green line of, forest operations, forest managers, they have to operate above this thin green line of we will call societal values and sustainability, right? Ecological integrity and all that kind of stuff. So forest management has to take place above that thin green line. And up until now, we have been, right? And I'm concerned that perhaps as we do more research, as science gets better, we have further understanding, more accurate understanding of forest dynamics and ecology. And with that, society's values begin to shift. I'm concerned that thin green line might start to creep upward a little bit, right, towards where forest operations are happening. And so with that, if that's true, the concern would be that over time, slowly at some point, forest operations may fall below that line, at which point we may lose the trust of the public, right? We may start to fall below what is deemed to be quote unquote sustainable. So whether or not that's happening, I don't know, but it seems like society is becoming more and more aware of what's going on in the landscape, and it behooves us to be prepared and to be leaders in this concept of sustainability, as opposed to being followers and kind of, trying to catch up to what society thinks, rather than leading them, right? So with all that in mind, I thought it would be good to start with each of you just talking about how you would define this word sustainability, right? Which we know is a relatively new word in the terms of modern society, and kind of what you think in relation to sustainable forest management, what sustainability means, what's included in that. So I was actually going to start with Milo, if that's okay. If Milo, you just want to say your name and then and your background a little bit, and then you can give me your definition of sustainability, what you think it is.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Milo Mihajlovich. I'm a recently retired professional forester. Spent my career working primarily in reforestation and at the interface of reforestation and forest management planning. So sort of forest renewal with an eye toward fiber production. The last 10 or 12 years of my career, I spent more in the interface zone between forest management and ecosystem services. So looking for that above and beyond Matt's thin green line and turning that into a sellable commodity beyond simple wood fiber. And in working in that zone, what I came to is that we do I would say, far better than adequate. I wouldn't say outstanding, but certainly a far better than adequate job of renewing the forest for the most part. I mean, there are some twitchy types of forests that are very hard for us to renew. But for the most part, we do really well. We exceed expectation. Unfortunately, we seem to assume that by putting the trees back, we have convinced everyone, not just ourselves, but everyone with a stake of forest sustainability. And when I moved into those other spheres, what I came to realize was a lot of folks don't understand how we use the concept of coarse filters. They don't understand the idea that if you get 95 or 97% of the parts back, that you're likely to have a functioning ecosystem. And we haven't done a very good job of seeking to understand those folks' understanding and then working with them to essentially share our view. And I hesitate to use the word educate because I don't think it's really a question of education. I think it's more a question of us validating people's concerns and then helping them understand that we appreciate their concerns and are working to include their values or their suite of concerns in the new forest or in the renewed forest. So I guess for me, sustainability is as much about the message as about the ecosystem out there in the forest.
Right. So not just about the forest cover, but everything else involved in it too.
Everything else, and having that conversation with people, and having it as a conversation between peers, not preaching, not evangelizing, not teaching.
Yeah. Well, you and I had that really good discussion just for Bob and Dan, where this all came from, right? We had a good discussion, a good recording a while back that hasn't been released for a different project. And we were talking about exactly that issue of forest professionals looking at public concerns as being like, well, it's okay because I know what I'm doing. Don't worry about it. Like, I got this. So we have to so you're saying we need to start to recognize that those public concerns need to be taken seriously and not just pushed aside as something that don't worry, we've thought about it. We got this. We need to make sure that they understand that we're actually paying attention to them and we care.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Bob, what would you like to add to that? Anything different viewpoint?
Yeah, on forest sustainability, I guess I could offer, a range of perspectives.
Let's start with your background just a little bit. Sorry, I forgot to get you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, happy to do that. So my name is Bob Wagner, and I'm currently a professor and head of the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University, which is in the state of Indiana in the U.S. Midwest. And my focus during my career has been as a forest researcher, primarily someone who's works in the area of silvicultural research, which is basically understanding how woodlands grow. My focus has been primarily in the area of forest regeneration. So I spent the better part of my 35, 40-year career working on understanding how forests regenerate after various forms of harvesting. And I've had the good fortune to do that same job in different parts of North America. I started in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, worked in the Rocky Mountains, and in Oregon, Washington, Utah, Idaho, and spent some fair bit of time in British Columbia and Alberta doing a couple different projects. So I have some understanding there. I've was responsible for forest vegetation management in the province of Ontario for about 8 years, worked on the Boreal and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forests, asking those same kinds of questions. Spent 18 years in the state of Maine working on the northeastern forest, the Acadian forest, which is shared with eastern Canada, and then more recently here in the U.S. Central hardwood region. So a bunch of different forest types. And as I've thought over the years about sustainability, in fact, I might add that my interest in sustainability was really the genesis of my forestry career, because it was very clear to me that unless we could regenerate forests after harvest, that forests weren't sustainable by definition. So I guess I come at the sustainability issue from sort of a very coarse perspective, that it's rooted first and foremost in whether we can successfully regenerate trees after human-caused disturbances.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, for sure. Regenerating forest cover, I think that goes without saying, right? Like that you're absolutely right. If we have nothing else, we absolutely need that. Like that is going to get us, who knows, 90, 80, 90, 95, 99% of the way there, I feel like, because we have that coarse filter approach, right? And I think that's where we want to make sure that approach is enough.
Yeah.
And if it's not, that maybe we need to go further. I don't know.
Yeah, Matt. Well, I think we take that for granted, but
Sure.
one of the things that got me started in forest regeneration interest back in the 1970s was that forest regeneration was not guaranteed. There were many forest ecosystems in North America, including the boreal, where we could not regenerate the forest successfully, and there was a lot of concern over that. So a lot of the early kind of modern forest science really started in these difficult places where we just weren't being successful. So we've been I want to say the research and the operations have been successful over time to really regenerate most forest ecosystems in North America after harvest. But my short memory of in forest time is that we weren't able to do that as humans very successfully in many places. So we really can't take that for granted and need to use that as the conversation about forest sustainability. The launching point is our ability to regenerate the forest.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Yeah. No, it took a lot of years, a lot of research, and a lot of money to get us to where we are today. So we can't take that for granted. That's for sure. Completely agree. So Dan, quick intro on you. What's going on with you? What do you know?
Yes, I'm Dan Harrison. I'm a professor of wildlife and forest ecology at the University of Maine. And I've spent 34 years working in the interface between academia and the commercial forest industry here in Maine, and specifically working on ways to maintain coarse filters of wildlife biodiversity in managed landscapes. I've worked specifically on American martins, which are kind of a late forest associated area sensitive species, meaning they need big blocks of mid and late successional forest, as well as Canada lynx and snowshoe hares, which need big blocks of early successional forest. And one of the things we found is that keeping hares and martins on the landscape as a coarse filter will bring along about 86% of the forest vertebrates here in Maine. So trying to simplify things for forest managers so they're not having to come up with individual management plans for all the different species. At the same time, when I look at sustainability from the standpoint of wildlife resources, it's not a simple topic. I mean, if you look at Aldo Leopold, who was one of the fathers of wildlife management, he said the art of successful tinkering is keeping all the parts. So, of course, that's what what we focus on, right?
For sure.
And we focus on not losing species. And so maintaining biodiversity is certainly the first baby step, although it's oftentimes a tall baby step in managed landscapes. So we want to keep all the species out there, but that's not really enough because we need to keep the structure, the age class distribution, the species composition, the areas of sufficient size that are going to support these various wildlife species. And we need to keep ecosystem function so that we need to keep viable populations of keystone species like snowshoe hares and beavers that provide other ecosystem services and promote forest health. And that takes us a step above biodiversity and says, we need to be focusing on populations of some organisms. And then the public is asking us constantly to maintain the species that they value at some acceptable levels. And oftentimes the public views sustainability through that lens, which can be really challenging because, here in Maine, if you ask the public, they want white-tailed deer populations at levels observed in the 50s and 60s. They want moose at levels we had in the 1980s. They want bears at current levels. And some people want to bring wolves back. And all those things are not necessarily compatible. So meeting the public's view of sustainability can be tough because it means sustaining the unique values that they cherish at some level that meets their needs. So I think balancing the biodiversity, the ecosystem function, and the public's perception are certainly huge challenges for us. And at the same time, foresters have spent the last 50 years, as Bob mentioned, kind of refining approaches to regenerating forest stands. And that's a big part of forest sustainability. But focusing on the stand doesn't always do it for wildlife because many of the species that I work on need viable forest landscapes, which rely on interactions among stands and maintaining stand areas and stand configurations in conditions that are going to promote species persistence into the future. So wildlife biodiversity isn't simple to measure, and it comes at us from a lot of different directions.
Oh, no kidding. Absolutely. But it's interesting that you found in Maine that because everyone always looks at, grizzly bears and deer and caribou and all these big megafauna as an umbrella species, right? Meanwhile, you got the snowshoe hare, and then you said the marten? No.
Yeah, it's
the marten. And
we like to use the Canada lynx because Canada lynx eat snowshoe hares. That's almost all they eat. So they're kind of a wide-ranging critter that, to be on the landscape, needs lots of snowshoe hares scattered across a lot of different stand types. Yeah. So they become kind of our landscape barometer. And then martens, on the other hand, want a different type of forest, almost on the other end of the successional spectrum than snowshoe hares, but they want big blocks of mid to late successional forest, not necessarily old growth. And so if you can keep martens and you can keep lynx, you've got young forest in big enough patches of functional configuration, and you've got older forest in big enough patches of adequate configuration and size. And all the other species, like the forest dependent, here it's conifer dependent forest birds that are under the squeeze currently. And they can get by if they've got those other things.
Yeah, no, for sure. So it's funny. I think we've covered a good cross section this first 20 minutes here, talking about all the different things that are involved in this thing. And I think we've provided some good context for how complicated all this is, which is great. So I think now the question is, how do we come up with the idea of the forest that we want? You know what I mean? When it comes to the sustainability aspect and what it's going to look like in the future, right? And how that differs from the forest of today. So like we said, the forest regeneration has to come first. That's number one. We have to plant what we cut down and make sure that comes back and is there. And then now we're talking about, now that we've accomplished that, monumental task over the last 50 years, we've sort of figured it out, and we can continue to do so. How do we expand from that? Because it's good that we've accomplished this thing, this huge thing, right? But I don't think the public cares if that means that some other values that they deem as worthy end up not being there, right? And so we have to make sure, and I think you guys would all agree, that we need to continue to push ourselves to, you know what I mean, to push the idea of sustainability and make sure that we're constantly addressing new issues as they come up. And I don't think that's a new idea in forestry. I think almost all forest professionals would agree with that statement. So it's not like this is a revolution here.
I guess the one thing I would add to this, and I guess to come off here, doing what the public wants. The dilemma for those of us managing forests of trying to understand what the public wants is that, well, which segment of the public are we talking about, and when are we talking about it? Public perspectives of what they want from the forest are dynamic and are constantly changing. And I think Dan is absolutely right. When we start talking about sustainable forest management, we really need to look at it from a landscape perspective. And I think the consensus probably of most foresters that are dealing with, have the luxury of dealing with large landscapes like you might find in Alberta is that the most important part will be keeping a forest on the landscape that's relatively native on the particular sites that are there, and maintaining all forms of age classes and structures of those forests over a long period of time. And Dan could probably chime in on this, but in doing so, you provide all of those niches over time that various organisms depend on are there. So however, I think about sustainability as being involved in this quite a number of times, particularly with a public interface, is that there is sustaining the forest itself, the physical thing that I just described on the landscape basis, but there's the political sustainability of forest management, and those are not the same thing. We could be doing everything on the landscape as forest managers, beautifully managing that forest in terms of providing the range of habitats over time that everything can be gained from. But it may very well be that the practices of obtaining that on the landscape may not be publicly acceptable, and therefore we lose our social license. And we're constantly wrestling with sustaining the forest itself, the physical thing, from political sustainability of forest management practices that are achieving that landscape.
I'd like to chime in here, Bob. I couldn't agree with you more. And I would disagree with one thing you said, though, and that's that we in Alberta have the luxury of dealing with large landscapes. We do deal with large landscapes, but we don't deal with them in vitro. We have several other substantial footprint resource extraction activities on those same landscapes. And the challenge we have in discussing sustainability is differentiating in the eyes of both the public and the political sphere the temporal nature of the various disturbances. And I mean, frequently in my experience, we see people essentially equating very long-term disturbance, so things like open cast mining or oil and gas extraction, and particularly oil and gas gathering facilities like pipelines, with forest harvesting, and seeing them essentially as similar disturbances, when in fact they're substantially different disturbances in terms of both their duration and their overall effect on habitat supply. And I think as forest managers, we've tended, at least here, to feel that, well, we'll do a good job with what we do, and we'll leave the solution of the landscape scale discussion to someone else. And I'm increasingly uncomfortable with that. We've had a couple of incidents in Alberta already where folks who are clearly parties of interest have used the Federal Species at Risk Act, which is our equivalent of your American Endangered Species Act, to take the government of Alberta and the government of Canada to court for not adequately protecting species at risk, with the consequence that the resource management practices impacting those species have been mandated by the courts. So the courts have actually developed policies to accommodate species at risk and handed them to the resource managers. And so where I come from these days is we're doing a great job with renewing the forest. We need to take that with us and sit down with other stakeholders, be they other resource extractors and processors, or be they public stakeholders, share that information, try and understand, and try and find some sort of collaborative position. Because having seen what the courts do, I'm not comfortable with the idea that courts would start telling us how we might renew forests and further how we might harvest forests. And I can see that potential existing, at least here in Alberta.
I'll jump in here. This is Dan. We've essentially played out that experiment over the last 30 years in Maine. And what happened was we had a sizable spruce budworm outbreak coupled with paper markets that were very robust. And we saw a lot of expansion in our mills and our mill capacity. And this coincided with extensive clear cutting in the 1970s and 1980s. And we had clear cuts up to 100 square kilometers in area. One of those famous clear cuts was called the Great Ragmuff Clear Cut. And the public perceived that as unsustainable and pressed for a Forest Practices Act. And the Forest Practices Act was not necessarily something that a silviculturalist would write or a wildlife ecologist, and it put disincentives on large clear cuts, which means over the next several years after the act was enacted in 1991, we saw a fragmentation of our existing mature forest patches with lots of small scattered clear cuts. And the response of the public to that was, well, we didn't really get what we wanted, so let's put forth a public referendum to ban all clear cutting, which, of course, would take a very important management tool out of the hands of foresters and wildlife managers. And so after 3 referendums to ban clear cutting, our forest landowners looked at the political capital this was costing and moved in a different direction. And they moved very rapidly away from clear cutting to partial harvesting. And the unintended consequence of that, which the general public couldn't forecast, was that to get the same amount of wood, you needed to harvest over twice as many acres on an annual basis. So that's now been going on for 3 decades, and that expanded forest harvesting footprint has been amateurized across about 10 million acres of partial harvests, which have occurred across northern Maine, which have in many ways homogenized our forests from a wildlife habitat standpoint and left us with only small fragments of those intact forests that martens need, and very small fragments of the large areas of early successional regenerating forests that things like the hares and the lynx need. And so we've seen a huge change in our forest here due to the public's perception that things weren't sustainable and not really understanding the science behind the actions that they were taking to supposedly make things better. Now, remember, I mentioned the Great Ragmuff Clear Cut, which spurred this all on. It was a 100 square kilometer clear cut. It became very infamous. But right now, 30 years later, the Great Ragmuff Clear Cut is one of the largest blocks of intact mid to late successional forest remaining in northern Maine on commercial forest lands. And
Yeah.
so I don't think people could have predicted the importance that clear cuts in the 1970s and 80s, particularly the big ones, were going to play in maintaining species like marten in today's landscape.
Yeah. And therein lies the problem with doing what the public wants, I suppose.
Yeah, and actually, Dan, I think, nicely makes the point with that story about the Maine Landscape and the Forest Practices Act, that, there was a lot of applauding that, wow, we finally got control of these unsustainable forest management practices, and through, political policy and as you just identified in Alberta, the use of courts. The minute courts are making forest management decisions, they are not holistic. They're based on a very narrow lawsuit on some particular practice, and then there's a response in policy to provincial government agencies and whatnot, as there was in the state of Maine, and it ends up with that sort of single factor approach of having the consequence of possibly creating a very unsustainable landscape over a period of time when the focus is just on one single practice over a very specific issue. And this is where forest managers may have the tools and the training to deliver that sustainable forest landscape, but then the unsustainable political nature of forest management practices, those two things intersect, and we end up actually being countering the very intent of the idea of sustainability that the public wanted. How we resolve that, I don't know. I guess I'd have a very lucrative consulting practice if I could do that in all of
that's
the
what we're here to
political
do, Bob.
jurisdictions.
Come on, don't you have the answers?
Absolutely. Well, and I've had the good fortune of working in various forest types and various political conditions, and it's the whole concept of sustainability, both political sustainability and sustainability of the thing, the forest, depends on really where you are and what stage that forest development is in. As Hamish Kimmins at University of British Columbia wrote a couple very nice papers about sort of the phases of how we get to sustainable forestry, from going from starting from an exploitive phase where there's non-sustainable exploitation of the landscape, and then there's a recognition that this is not sustainable, and then there's a whole bunch of regulatory rules, which he calls administrative forestry, coming into play, and then eventually there's a view, and I think Maine is going through this now, where just strictly administrative forestry, the use of rules, still doesn't get the sustainable forestry that that society wants. And then there's a move to an ecological phase where the focus is on the broader, multi-values that the forest landscape can bring, but may or may not, be providing those social values. And he identifies the final stage of this, of sustainable forestry, is what he calls social forestry, where there's really ecologically based multi-value ecosystem management. So it's what is sustainable evolves based on the social political condition and the condition of the forest itself over time, and that story plays out differently depending on the forest type and the political context that forest type is placed in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there, Bob. I completely agree with what you're saying. And I said earlier I'm retired, but I have a hobby. And my hobby right now is that actually the company Matt works for in his day job remeasured several old plantations for me. And these were old plantations that had a variety of silvicultural practices applied to them, and then had controls left in the plantations where the practices were not applied. And what we did is we did something very different than the typical silviculturist remeasurement. These are 25 to 40-year-old reforested areas. So they're young forests, 25 to 40 years old, essentially. And what we did is we quantified the fiber, but we also quantified biological diversity using a whole array of ecological measures. And the idea being that we could then talk about reforestation in terms of sustainability. And we're very happy with the outcomes. We found essentially that the forests that we're putting back on the landscape are quantitatively very diverse and provide quite an array of habitats. And what we did is we went one step further and we took that information and actually turned it into a self-guided tour package so that we can make that available either to forestry professionals or to interested members of the public, that they can go out and look at these new forests and realize and understand, more importantly, what they're seeing. And as part of this exercise, we did a field tour a year ago of a few of these areas with a group of professional foresters. And to get to one of the sites, we drove through about 20 miles of renewed forest, like in a variety of block sizes and shapes, but adjacent to the road for most of the time was 15 to 35-year-old renewed forest. And we did our little tour of the cut block, and then we assembled, of the former cut block, the new forest, now assembled back at the vehicles to go to the next stop. And I asked the group as a whole, what did you see driving through here? What were you driving through? And everybody said, we were driving through forest. And I said, that's absolutely the right answer, except you should have added one more word, and that's new. And I think what we need to do is be much more conscious of our success in forest renewal and be much more diligent in speaking to that success and in raising the consciousness of other folks. I've taken several members of the public to renewed forest and talked to them about it. And most times when we get there, people have real problems believing that in a very short time span, we've moved from a clear cut to this beautiful young forest. And I think we as foresters tend to talk in terms of tree growth and in terms of species composition, when sometimes we'd be better served by framing it as a diverse ecosystem or a vigorous young forest, and thinking more in terms of trees as the warp and weft of a fabric around which we weave a forest. Mm. And so we talk, and I don't think it's a matter of changing our perspective so much as it's a matter of understanding that the listeners that we're speaking to or speaking with frequently don't really make that connection between the fact that we've been successful with the trees, which means that we have a forest. And by focusing on the trees, I think we oftentimes lose that listener. So it's not so much that I feel that I want the public to tell me what they want out of the forest, as I want that conversation with the public so I can demonstrate to them that the things that they want are attainable and are likely to be there at some point in time, someplace in this renewed forest. But that we can't have it all everywhere, or we end up exactly where Dan says Maine headed to, which is essentially a homogenized system that has marginal utility for anything.
Yeah, it puts us in a weird spot.
I think related to that, I think oftentimes conservationists and the general public for sure confuse the concept of sustainable forests with pristine conditions. And I think we need to focus on the fact that there are a lot of opportunities to enhance wildlife habitat, biodiversity, sustainability in forests, where human management is altering structure in ways that can benefit other species, because wildlife don't really care about the age of a tree or necessarily even the species of the tree. They're more interested in general in the structure, the vertical and horizontal structure, the canopy cover, and things that are going to provide them protection from predators, food, that kind of thing. So when I look at Maine, here we had this area of extensive clear cuts during the 70s and 80s, but when Canada lynx were listed as a federally threatened species, it turned out that the snowshoe hare populations that occurred in those extensive areas of regenerating forests supported more of this threatened species within the confines of the state of Maine than all of the other lower 47 states in the U.S. combined. And so we had more lynx here than there were in the rest of the country, including a lot of the western states that got a lot of attention about lynx conservation. And the reason for that was very active forest management that provided favorable forest structure. And we've seen the same thing with a lot of conifer-associated forest birds, that where they're living now are in places that were clear-cut and then herbicided to suppress competing deciduous vegetation. So those are the stands that now have the high conifer composition that are supporting some of the largest populations of spruce fir associated forest birds in the lower 48 states in the U.S. Another species that we found really benefit is species of concern here in the Northeast is the spruce grouse. And here in these transitional forests, we don't get big enough patches of conifer forest in these managed landscapes to really be favorable for spruce grouse. Well, what we found is that in these stands that were clear cut and then herbicided and then pre-commercially thinned, it accelerated forest succession and forest structure such that at a much younger age, we reached optimal spruce grouse habitat conditions. And so there were a lot of positive benefits of managing forests in ways that altered species composition and accelerated succession. And I think we need to be better at communicating those benefits so that the public can understand that forestry isn't just removing trees, but it's creating habitat.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in a system, and I don't even know if I want to go down this road, but I'm going to do it anyways, is in a system where, since colonization, we've kind of started suppressing wildfire and removed a lot of that natural disturbance off the landscape, and even removed, the burning by indigenous people that they did for, ever, removed that from the landscape as well. And, there's some argument that forest harvest may help in supplementing that loss of fire. Not to say they're the same thing at all, and we don't have to go down that route either. But yeah, there's a different tale to be told there for sure. And I think we kind of suck at telling it. So it almost sounds like this, like everything we've said so far, we spent a lot of time talking about just trying to get the public and our values to be the same thing. Or not even that, I suppose. We're just trying to make sure that we do what is right for the landscape and for everybody and for all values. And I feel like we do that. So is the problem, in your guys' opinion, that we need to do more public outreach? We need to talk more to the public just as individuals and have bigger, bigger campaigns to do stuff like that? Or is there actually something we're missing in management that is reasonable that we should be attending to, that is a concern of the public's that we haven't already?
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in here in that a lot of I think many foresters in communicating with the public about what we're doing don't really fully understand the context and why forests as an issue are so emotional to most people. And when we think about it, it's really links back to this human nature relationship, and that we have, in the places we live, the cities and urban areas, we literally have given up the idea of having nature there for the most part.
Sure.
And we also understand that we don't need to be sustainable with landscapes where we live, because we're going to create them to live as we see fit. The other place that we sacrifice the landscape is in agricultural areas. Everybody understands eating, and we're happy to sacrifice the natural prairie or forests landscapes in exchange for monocultures of food that we understand that. And then in our minds we have sacrificed nature because we want to displace that for food production. We all understand that. So where does that leave nature? It leaves nature and the human relationship to it in forests. And so the controversy around forest practices and the court cases and the regulations and whatnot, I think, come back to this deep gut level understanding and appreciation and desire for nature. And we as foresters have sort of been by default made the curators of nature. And people feel a lack of nature, and so they're trying to get the forest to be that place. And that idea, that human nature conflicts, ends up on the forested landscape and all of the things that we're talking about here today.
That's a really good way to put it. I like that. It's kind of been so getting into that idea that of nature, right? Of natural, of nature. How do we begin? Like we had a few discussions earlier, Dan and Bob and I, about, the natural environment, quote unquote natural, right? And so if we're trying to define this future forest of what we want on the landscape, right, of what people want and what we need, and so it meets all values, a lot of people, like a public, I think especially, tries to think of that as they want something natural, quote unquote, right? And trying to define that idea of natural is problematic, as you guys all know. That, what do you mean by natural? Does that mean void of human context? Because people have been, First Nations people have been in North America for, some people say, 20,000 years or more, right? So, and they've been managing the landscape throughout that whole time. So does that mean pre-colonization, because it was still people? And then do you mean like void of wildfire? Everyone hates wildfire right now because it's for obvious reasons, right? But no, that's a natural ingredient as well. And so how do we begin to define this concept of natural? You know what I mean? Is it, I don't know.
I'm going to answer you by analogy, Matt. And,
I like analogies.
I think that one of the real challenges we have in communicating our success is this very issue. The nub of it is this desire on the part of the public, and I'm being very generic here, to see forests as something natural. And we respond by trotting out an array of management interventions we do to put trees back.
Yeah.
And in effect, what we're doing is we're putting things out there that a lot of our listeners will, or a lot of our fellow conversationists will hear as unnatural. So in fact, we're thinking we're reassuring them, and in fact, what we're doing is challenging them, because, site preparation, planting, and oh my God, the big H, herbicide, all are unnatural in their initial reaction.
Their definition of it,
and I guess what this has done for me is kind of bring me to a point of going, yeah, so what I'm doing when I'm out there talking to people about forests and de-emphasizing the trees, treating the trees more as structural foundation for forest, I've moved my argument off practices and onto outcomes. And I talk to people about forests, not about the practices of forest renewal.
Not what we're going to do, but what it's going to look
like. But what we've achieved. And is this a forest you like? As opposed to, I herbicided this and look how great it is.
Yeah.
So I think foresters as a group are very uncomfortable with that. I've over the years, I've been involved in a lot of herbicide consultation. My experience has been that foresters are very uncomfortable going to the softer, more value oriented conversation as opposed to the technical conversation.
We're not really trained for that, I don't think.
But here's the question I throw back at you, Matt.
Yeah.
Is why did you get into forestry?
Oh, I know why I'm in forestry, and it's for all these reasons that we discussed, right? The idea of having as much natural, forests on the landscape, to have sustainability, to make sure there's always moose and there's always grassland and there's always, grazing opportunities and mule deer and you know what I mean, and habitat for everything and good clean water and all of these things. And I think that's the reason that all forest professionals get into it. I don't think there's a forest professional out there that's like, you know what? I really love 2x4s. I just want to pump those babies out until kingdom come. I think there's a value added there because you're responsible for building houses and there's huge responsibility there and huge benefit there. But at the core, we got into it for the most part because as kids, we liked digging holes in the bush or whatever, building forts or whatever, right? Like that's where it is. So this idea of natural, and yeah, I like that. I like that way, the way you put it though, right? Of talking about the outcomes, talking about what you're going to get when we're done here.
What I'm advocating here is that as foresters, we need to return to that original motivation.
Kid mode. Back to kid mode.
Yeah. And what brought us into forestry and our passion for forests. Because you're right. The vast majority of foresters have a passion for forests and share that passion as opposed to lead with the technical. The technical is a means to an outcome.
Sure.
And that outcome is in most cases very positive. So if we share that outcome in a positive way, we're going to be talking to that deep-seated need people have. And I would say here in Canada, that's probably, not probably, but it might be stronger even than the U.S. because those other landscapes that Bob talked about, the agricultural and the urban, those are private landscapes. Those are owned by individuals. But the forest landscape is seen as a public good, and the public feels they own the forest. And so that even, I think, amplifies their passion for forests.
Well, and they do, right? Technically speaking, it's a public landscape, and we have the privilege, at least in Canada, most of it's public, right? In the States, it's a little bit different story, but here we have the privilege of being able to manage it, right? And we can and will lose that privilege if we don't, you know what I mean, pay attention to what people want, unfortunately. But yeah.
I'll chime in here and add to what Milo said about outcome. And outcome-based forestry is, I think, emerging as a dominant theme. And in particular, when we start talking with the public, and I think Milo made this point, is that when if we talk about outcomes on the landscape, we can probably agree most often with many public groups about what that future forest would look like. And if we focus on and can agree on the outcomes, there are many more points of agreement on the outcomes. Where we start getting into difficulty, as Milo said, and it's certainly been my experience over the years, is the practices that we use to achieve those outcomes. And if we focus too much and have public battles on the methods that we used, fire or harvesting, high intensity fire, or high intensity harvesting, or site preparation, the kinds of things that for a short time many see as unsustainable. And as Dan said, for those stands that were, big clear cuts that were seen as unsustainable, and we needed to do something to prevent those things, 30 years later are outstanding habitat for a wide range of species. So it's important that the public understand that nature in the forest is not a static thing. It's just a constantly changing thing, and that the practices we use are directed toward achieving an outcome that they would find desirable. How we get from this regulatory focus on practices to a conversation about what the outcomes need to look like, and actually do forestry so that we are monitoring the achievement of those defined outcomes ahead of time and demonstrating through rigorous metrics that the public land managers of Albertan forests are achieving these outcome metrics in a satisfactory way. The focus can then shift away from the methods that they're using to accomplish those metrics, because we can all agree these are good outcomes, and we're documenting our progress toward those outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when we manage at the stand level and we focus at the stand level, those outcomes are easy to quantify, but don't really get us to the issue of sustainability. And I think a real challenge for us working together across disciplines is to try and decide what is a sustainable landscape. Because within that landscape, you can have a triad of activities. You can have areas with no forest harvesting, maybe your high altitude or your unproductive, poorly drained sites, which can be your forest preserves. And then those may be balanced with some areas of intensive forestry with more intensive silvicultural approaches, and some areas with that fall in the middle with more softer ecological forestry. But as long as you're getting the landscape outcome I think you can that you're looking for, I think you can sell all of those things to the public. And it's just a matter of us working better together, I think, to define what do we want the forest landscape to look like and what do we want it to produce.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's kind of that's where we're misunderstanding one another, right? The public and the professional side of it. So is it all a question? Is it all a question of just being better at talking, being better at telling our story, or is there, like you said, like what Dan was saying, there's a way to do it that might be a little bit differently?
I think Dan brings us to a really important part of success, and that is reaching across the landscape. And I would go a step past Dan on this, and that's, again, based on my Alberta experience where we have other industrial footprints on that same landscape. But the whole idea of looking across the landscape, so lifting our head up, I mean, when we first started talking about this, we were really looking at trees.
Yeah.
And we lifted our head up to the stand. We need to lift our head up again to the landscape. And we need to have a conversation with other managers on that landscape. And, we currently have a project on the go here in Alberta where we have several different industries around a table talking about managing a shared landscape and looking at directly at habitat supply for 17 identified key species on that landscape. And I think that that's another vital part. We can't simply talk to the public. We also have to be in a position where if the public raises their head up from what we're showing them and says, well, this is great, but there's a pipeline goes right through the middle of it. What does that mean? That we can answer that.
Right.
And that we've thought about that. Because that's the other piece of this. We can do the very best possible job with forestry. And I'll give you an example. I was involved in a cut block that cost about $160,000 to plan and lay out because it was in caribou habitat. And we laid out this 700-odd hectare cut block with caribou habitat supply in mind. And the vertical retention on the cut block, the block design, everything was built around making it usable by caribou and protecting them from predator access. And, we practically dislocated our arms, patting ourselves on the back over this cut block. And 3 years later, I went back to do a post-planting assessment of the block, and there was a gas plant and a battery, which were parked right in the middle of the block. So all that effort, all that planning on the forestry side got completely missed when the energy sector showed up. And I'm not wanting to point a finger at the energy sector here. What I'm pointing a finger at is a lack of coordination, a lack of sort of shared planning on that landscape so that we don't trip over each other when we act on that landscape. And unless we have that landscape view, we can't do that. So I'd absolutely second what Dan said about keeping our meta focus at the level of the landscape.
Yeah, I like that. Well, something you said to me a while back, I don't remember if it was in recording or not, but it was something you said, foresters, we see the trees. When we think of the forest, we think about the trees, right? Whereas if you were to talk to a forager, when you ask them, how do you define a forest? They would probably describe the vegetation in the understory, and they describe the mushrooms and the draws where you can find certain plants, and they describe it that way. They probably wouldn't even mention, they might mention, a pine stand, you can find blueberries or whatever, but they're talking about the lower veg. And if you were to ask a hunter, well, what's a forest? They would describe the mooselik and, the elk rub, and they would define the draw, and they would, you know what I mean? So we're all seeing these different parts of the forest and defining them as forest. Whereas, so as professionals, what you're saying is we need to be able to step back from, the trees perspective and try to see the forest for everything that it is, right? Not just for the trees.
Yeah, we need to see that landscape. We need to think in terms of that landscape.
Right.
I was going to say, as someone who's been in charge of a couple forestry programs where we're turning off forest managers, I think we do, and of course I can't speak for the foresters in Alberta coming out of U of A or UBC, but
we're doing a better job than you, that's for sure.
I'm familiar with a lot of forestry programs around North America, and I think we do a pretty good job educating foresters that when they're out in the forest, that they are literally managing for all of these features, forest habitat. And it's hard, I think, to find even an older forester these days that doesn't, and it's at their core, understand that when they're doing anything in the forest, they're having an impact on a wide range of values, water quality and wildlife habitat, and so forth. So I think we understand that, and I know firsthand that foresters do. It may be that depending on who they go off and work for and whatnot, their focus may shift. But I think we do a pretty good job for the most part, giving foresters that broad view. They're just not looking at the forest as a pile of 2x4s that need to be removed as quickly as possible. If that's what we're producing as in forestry schools, we're sadly failing.
Yeah, we're in trouble. No, and I would agree with you 100%. I don't think that that's what we're producing at all. I think we're producing people who are coming out as professionals and want all of those values to be intact, and they're thinking about it. But I think over time, sometimes we might lose the perspective of those values, right? Like I think we may think that, we're doing a great job and we're happy with what we're doing, and we don't notice where we might be able to do an extraordinary job on top of above and beyond what's expected by just paying a little bit of attention. Like I have an example in regards to we're involved in working with some First Nations groups up in Northern Alberta, and we went out to a proposed cut block talking about what they would like to do in relation to some of the plants on the ground and the proximity to some moose habitat and some sedges, some flooded area, right? And they just suggested, you know what would help us out a lot right here? It's like, this is a really important spot for us. There's a lot of really good plants that we want to have access to. It's a rare kind of site. It'd be great if you just move the boundary of this cut block back 10 meters. That would be awesome, right? The operator will lose 5 or 6 trees in that spot or whatever, right? It's minuscule to them, and it's something that a forest manager can do. They can make that decision, but without having those discussions with those groups, we don't do those simple little things. I don't think that we're doing anything bad on the grand scheme of things. I just think that there's probably little details that we've maybe missed that may be able to drastically improve forest dynamics for not just other people with other values, but other values in general, that we may be able to do at minimal cost to us, and may produce ultimately a better relationship with the public, as well as a healthier, more vibrant forest, right? And I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just saying I feel like that may be the case, that maybe we've gotten a little comfortable in our thoughts of being sustainable. And I agree, we've done a great job. I'm very thankful for all the work that's gone into everything that we've done. And I like I said at the beginning about the thin green line, right? I'm concerned that the public perspective is moving that thin green line upwards towards where we're operating. And I don't want our management levels to ever fall, or operations to fall below that line, because then we endanger the whole thing, right? And not just the industry, but we endanger the health of the forest, because as we know, we're you know what I mean, we're doing what's appropriate. So kind of an open-ended question. But
well, I think defining where that line sits really involves setting the scale at which we want to make our progress. So, for example, if you take some of the national wildlife refuges, we looked at those as farms for particular species. So here in Maine, we have Moosehorn National Wildlife Refuge, and we were cutting small openings in the forest, small clear cuts in the forest, and setting back succession to create habitat for American woodcock. Well, the refuge sits in a landscape that's dominated by commercial forestry, where for free, folks were creating woodcock habitat and being penalized for it under the Maine Forest Practices Act. And meanwhile, when you back off and look at the Moosehorn National Wildlife Refuge from space, it's the biggest block of intact spruce fir forest to provide the values and the habitats that are needed to keep a viable landscape and to create and to maintain some of the things that are lacking in the intensively managed forests nearby. So here it was just an issue of scale, where we were treating on National Wildlife Refuge as a farm for our favorite species. And I think with forest management, we can treat stands to promote our favorite species. And as fisheries biologists, we can manage bodies of water and stock them full of our favorite species. But I think for all of our disciplines, the challenge for us as we move forward is to step back and look at a broader scale and see how our pond or our refuge or our forest stand fits into keeping the landscape out there that we want to see going into the future.
So it sounds like we almost need to have like a round table management. You know what I mean? To get all the stakeholders at the same place to look at the development plans every year and be like, okay, where do we have overlap? Where are we doing something wrong? Where can we make small changes that will help everybody out? But I don't think the logistics of that is just terrifying to think about.
But, being the oldest guy at the table, because I've been around that tree longer than Bob, when when I started my career in forestry in an age of paper maps and aerial photographs, you would be absolutely right, Matt, in saying this idea is terrifying. But in today's world with GIS and the caliber of GIS and artificial intelligence integration, and with the quality of imagery we can collect and the sort of spatial recording we can do of all the activities that occur on the landscape, it's feasible to lift our eyes up to the landscape and think at that level, because we've got the tools to allow us to do that. And I don't know that you want a table of stakeholders and professionals at the same time, but I think one of the things that we as foresters in Alberta could do better is to engage with our peers in the sphere of wildlife management around the landscape, and then take what we learn from those conversations and use that to inform our conversations with other stakeholders. And like I say, we have the tools. I mean, this project I'm working on that's multi-industry is underpinned by taking the forest inventory data from the forest management concern on whose landscape we're operating, and integrating it spatially with the energy sector and the energy transmission sectors to essentially establish a cumulative footprint, but then also start bringing in the planning processes so we can see where the various sectors would like to go in the future and think about that impact before it occurs.
Yeah. Reduce the total footprint on the landscape, which has been a huge concern for a lot of those NGO groups, right? Yeah. So it's and it is a concern. We talk about things like caribou and that. So for sure.
Well, and also by anticipating, I mean, one of the things we're finding is that, you're going to want to be there and I want to be there now. So maybe what we do is plan so that my disturbance transmutes into your disturbance over time. And as a result, the cumulative disturbance is reduced.
Yeah.
Or it's more focused. And, the other piece that comes into this is, and I mean, I'm at the edge of my expertise here, and I'm sure Dan knows far more about this than I do, but we've got habitat supply models. So we can now look at impact on habitat through time and space. And so it lets us be much more informed before we actually take the action.
Yeah, for sure. And that sounds like what we need. Is just like the more information, the better, really, right? Like how can more information be bad, really? So, Bob, I sense you have something you want to say. No?
No, I'm just listening to Milo and agree with what he's saying. The one thing I guess I will add to that is some of my excitement about where we're headed. And we talked earlier about outcome-based forestry, and Milo was talking about our ability to see things on landscape. And we're really emerging, I think, on a revolution of forest management and what we're calling digital forestry or digital natural resources, where the ability to use various kinds of imagery and artificial intelligence and big data and analytics we're rapidly moving to a stage where we can look and quantify on a almost real time landscape level conditions for a wide variety of natural resources, wildlife habitat and whatnot. And Dan's done some really outstanding work in that area in terms of understanding landscapes and the impact on habitat supply that Milo just mentioned. So as we're talking about outcome-based forestry, the technology is rapidly evolving to allow us to monitor and manage those landscape level properties that we could never really do before. So I'm more excited than I've been probably in many stages of my career, where the technology is going to allow us to do things that we just couldn't think of before, from the point of view of documenting sustainability and being able to manage and shift landscapes over time to get what we need to support the values that the public is looking for.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you're totally right. Like the technology available to us today it's astronomical, right? Like it's never before seen. And so like we're definitely going to be able to see more oversight and more detailed planning, more interlocking values, right? That can coexist on the landscape with just a little bit of conversation and forethought and planning. Like I don't think this is something where we need to drastically change forestry at all. I just think it's something where with a little bit of communication, all of a sudden it can be significantly more inclusive, right? So I absolutely agree, and the opportunity is now there because of the technology for sure.
Right, and for the first time, we have the opportunity to put forest projection modeling together with habitat supply modeling and project landscapes for both trees and wildlife into the future. Mm-hmm. And I think the real challenge for us is to come to some common ground with our publics about what is the landscape outcome that we want to achieve, because the tools are there to predict what a landscape's going to be under different forest harvesting scenarios and what the wildlife habitat supply will be under those different scenarios, but deciding whether that's acceptable and how we would want to tweak that to achieve a desired outcome, I think we're really lagging on. We haven't really got to the point of deciding what we want landscapes to look like.
Yeah, right. I think you're right about that for sure. I had something I've been thinking about over the course of this whole podcast and even a little bit beforehand was with this new technology, right? All the technology that we have, the ability to overlap different data and different values, like you said, habitat with cutting sequence and all that kind of stuff. I've been thinking about, would it be possible to make like a decision tool that you could somehow create value? So say just for simplicity's sake, you added a dollar value to all the values on the landscape, right? So you're going to go cut this white spruce stand. What are all of its accrued value, right? And okay, so there's some moose habitat, there's hare habitat, there's some bird habitat 'cause it's an old stand, there's some vertical complexity. We've got it's on a drainage site, so we've got some water filtration going on there. And if you could start to create water or dollar values for all of these things, so the ecosystem-based services actually provide some kind of dollar value, and then compare that to the dollar value of the timber, would it be possible to make a decision tool where managers could input all of these things and say, okay, is it worth it for us to cut this stand, or is it better for us to leave this stand? Or maybe we only cut this portion and leave that portion. Or do you think it's possible, I mean, just as a tool to help managers maybe see more of what's out there and what the actual value is to society? Do you think that's possible?
I'd be skeptical. And the reason I would be is that you've got the value prior to harvest. Yeah. But those values don't all set to zero at the time of harvest. And in fact,
no, it's very complicated.
So what new forest trajectory do you want to establish after you harvest that stand, and what value accrues to those various trajectories? You're going to get yourself into a bewildering array of numeracy. And we've been playing with just modeling cumulative impact in this roundtable we've got among the various industry players. Mm-hmm. And our modeler has lost probably 2/3 of his hair in the course of that exercise. And it's just, these systems have so many trajectories they can go on. And, as a consequence, you can bury yourself. And I think we'd be much better served to keep it at a more coarse level right now, but think a lot about outcomes. And, this is one where I'm going to get on my soapbox. We've got some absolutely tremendous reforestation outcomes,
of course,
in the northern forest. And I mean, I date back to the era Bob talked about, where there was grave concern about our success in reforesting the boreal forest post-harvest. And the outcomes I see now, had I seen images of them at the start of my career, I would have dismissed them as fantasy. Mm. And we do that routinely now. And so that, I think we need to become, we're very good at purposeful reforestation. We need to start thinking in terms of desired outcomes. Yeah. And I mean, we've had some conversation around that in Alberta over the last 15 years with the idea of restoring to broad cover groups. But I think broad cover groups and they lend themselves to perversion. So we've had perverse effects with broad cover group-based reforestation. We need to have folks whose interests are in the values associated with those diverse outcomes at the table with us as we talk about outcome-based forestry. So we need guys like Dan saying, no, when you create a mixed wood by leaving the aspen live on 2/3 of the cut block and spraying 1/3 of the cut block with glyphosate, that isn't giving me the mixed wood outcome I want for these reasons.
Right.
So I think we need now to start thinking in terms of the ecological function, the ecological or ecosystem services, values of the various outcomes, rather than trying to monetize them right off the get-go. Think more in terms of the ecological values.
Yeah.
And I think at some point we may get to a point where money becomes the great equator. But for now, I don't think we've done as good a job in developing reforestation practices for complex boreal forests as we've done for the more simple forests. Sure. So our spruce aspen mixed woods are an area where we should be working with folks who understand the broader array of values associated with those forests to develop strategies to reforest those particular forest types and maintain them on the landscape.
I'd like to follow up on, I think, Matt, what you said, and Milo about ecosystem services, and I think you presented the scenario of trying to monetize those ecosystem services. This is one of those things that is really being written about and analyzed heavily these days. And one of the great, I guess, advantages and disadvantages we've had as foresters is that really the only value that, the multitude that come off of forest landscapes is the value of a cubic meter of wood. It's got a market. It can be easily monetized. When we look at landscapes, the value of that standing wood is very clear. Unfortunately, monetizing wildlife habitat, clean air, clean water, and aesthetic vistas, and all of these other values that are provided by that same forest have been much more difficult. And therefore, when you monetize just one value, it becomes easy to have that be dominant. I think I'm a little more optimistic than Milo that with the analytical strategies that I see today moving forward, and I mean literally over the past decade, I'm becoming more optimistic that we're going to be able to not necessarily monetize, as you suggest, every single ecosystem service, but where we have a much better understanding of how various landscape management plans will affect that, the multitude of those ecosystem services. And we can, through an analytical process of that landscape, find a relatively acceptable, optimal solution where the most ecosystem services of various kinds, including timber value, can be included in the decision making that goes on. Today, we're managing largely over many places for the wood, and because wood is standing trees, we get these ecosystem services by default. And this is, I think, one of our failings in communicating with the public, in that they understand ecosystem services, although they might not call them that, and they always perceive this conflict between the monetized ecosystem service wood and all of the other things that are out there. I think we're poised to have a much more sophisticated analysis and conversation about how we're optimizing all of those things on the landscape. So I'm a bit more optimistic. It's a very thorny and complicated analytical problem, but the computing and the monitoring is so rapidly advancing that we might get to a place where we can do that much more feasibly than we're doing today.
Right. Well, you have to forgive Milo, as he said himself. He's old, right? So, but and I guess I should restate my question a little bit. Just the only reason I use dollar value, the monetization of it, was because that's kind of what our economy understands, right? So all I meant is it possible to create a decision tool that allows us to discern an action on the landscape and whether or not that action is worthwhile in the long run or not, or if it's better left to some other value, right? But no, I think like you said, we're getting there anyways with these conversations being had between biologists and foresters and hydrologists and everything else, right? So we're getting to that point. And are you guys confident that we'll continue to stay above that thin green line when it comes to public perception? And because the fear is that we have something like what happened in Maine, right? And you have a total disruption of the forest dynamics because of perceived perception of forest industry, or like something like the spotted owl situation, right? Where so you want to make sure that you're protecting those values. And are you confident that we're going to continue to do that and stay above that thin green line where we don't all of a sudden get kicked off the landscape?
Well, I think if we know where we want to go, where that green line is, I think we have the tools to get there. I'll give you an example. We had a project here in northern Maine, across about 60,000 hectares, where we're working with an NGO who had acquired forest land for multiple values, and they wanted to maintain buffers along a wilderness river of significance. They wanted to maintain forest harvest volumes at a target level to pay for their project and to cover their costs and provide some profit so that they could reinvest in other conservation projects. They wanted to maintain a target marten population level at the mid to late successional side of the spectrum, and they wanted to keep a target lynx population level at the early successional side of the spectrum. And we did some habitat supply modeling and forest yield modeling, worked with their foresters, and determined that we could meet all those goals, but that there were certain bottlenecks. One of the bottlenecks was that the landscape that had been purchased had a history of intensive forestry and needed to rest but only for 5 years, to allow some of the stands to get to the stage where they could provide lynx habitat. We found that we couldn't meet the harvest volume projections or targets without having some ecological reserves. So in places that were less productive and less valuable for timber, this conservation landowner expanded some ecological reserves, and then they could meet their marten habitat objectives. And all of this meant that on the remaining landscape, they were able to conduct forestry as they wanted, as they planned to meet their harvest volume objectives without compromising biodiversity. But until we knew where we wanted to go and how we were going to quantify those values, we couldn't determine whether it was at all sustainable. And in fact, it wouldn't have been sustainable except for a 5-year rest at the front end of the harvest cycle. But that wasn't a very big sacrifice, given that this was a 50-year plan.
Right. Yeah, and all those plans go into to most of the public land forestry that's going on, right? They're doing all of that, the 200-year planning horizons, right? So it's, I'm confident that we're moving in that direction, and I'm confident that the people doing this work have the right intention at heart and the right values and the right perspective. Maybe the perspective needs to be shifted a little bit to maybe include a little more of the public perceived value, right? Or perhaps just to, slightly alter the way we do things just to include them a little bit more. I'm not sure, and this is all coming from somebody who I don't make forest management plans. I'm not working for a mill. So my perception is definitely biased and skewed in that as well. So, but I'm very confident that as a society, the forest industry will continue to do what's right. And it's just a matter of whether or not we can stay above that green line where the public thinks we're doing what's right. And I hope so, because that would be bad, to say the least.
I guess the one the thing that always concerns me, particularly in a place like Alberta, is that there's probably too much hysteria over forest sustainability.
Sure.
You don't have to travel very far if you've spent any time in Europe. The native forests are completely gone. They don't have the ability to recover that forest in most of the European countries is long since passed, a couple centuries ago. So you can go to places like New Zealand and see where the native forest has been removed completely. And I think the people of Alberta can, rest pretty comfortably in the sense that, the boreal forest and all of its pieces are still largely intact. And we're not talking about regenerating exotic tree species, which is an issue in many parts of the world. There's a lot of, if you will, landscape luxury that to provide that native habitat over a long period of time. It's not ruined, and a few minor practices here or there or policies aren't going to probably change that from a relative perspective. Doesn't mean you can't do a better job, but it's not a crisis, I guess, is where I'm coming from compared to the condition of forest and the opportunities the public has to return that forest to the whatever level of natural state that they're seeking. So I think tone back the conversation a little bit and be thankful for all of the opportunities that you've got to manage that forest landscape. It's all under provincial control over large blocks of land. That is a real problem. And Dan can tell you, in many places where much of the forest cover is owned privately, and all you have to do is go to the other end of the country, to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where the percentage of the forest landscape that is privately owned matches many parts of the United States. It's a much more, we can develop the best models, know exactly what a forest landscape should look like to provide all of those values, but getting the owners to all be in harmony over that to get the collective landscape is an almost impossible legal and political process. And where Dan is in Maine, there are large private landowners that own most of that forest, but they own many, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of hectares of forest land, so they can actually do landscape management. So Alberta not only has the luxury of all of the native pieces still being there, but it also has a land ownership pattern that will allow landscape level management that most other parts of the world in managing their forests are just incapable of doing because of that.
Oh, you're absolutely right. No, we definitely have to take stock and be thankful for what we have, because you're right. It's there's not a lot of this going around in the world right now. That's for sure.
Well, from that main perspective that Bob was just talking about, we have less than 0.5% of functional old growth forest remaining on our landscape. Yet we don't know of a single species of wildlife that we've lost in terms of our first step of maintaining biodiversity. But that's not to say that we're doing as good of a job as we could, and that we're planning for maintaining viable populations into the future and maintaining ecosystem functions and all the other things I talked about earlier. So I think viable landscapes is the next step for us here. But as Bob mentioned, it's a much more difficult step when you're crossing land ownerships than it is for you folks in Alberta or just in the boreal forest biome, where you've got large contiguous areas of forest that can truly be managed with landscape objectives in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something that gives me a lot of optimism, Matt, is that when I look at the current generation of forest management professionals and the emergent generation, folks your age and somewhat younger, I see a passion for this kind of conversation and this kind of engagement. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you mentioned earlier, nobody goes into forestry because they want to produce 2x4s. You're absolutely right. But that said, I think that frequently we're socialized not into wanting to produce 2x4s, but in wanting to produce management plans and being about wood supply and becoming somewhat fiber-centric in our view of the forest. I mean, it's a part of the process.
Yeah, it's inevitable. Yeah.
But what I see in the coming generation is a reluctance to accept that socialization and a willingness and a comfort with continuing to hold the love of the forest close and to let that love show and to let that deep, abiding passion for forests show. And I think that more than anything else is going to help us stay ahead of that green line.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it's about having the passion and the excitement and the desire to do better that's going to help forest managers learn these emergent skills that Bob was talking about so that they can operate effectively at the landscape that Dan is absolutely right in telling us we need to operate at. So I'm optimistic for the future of forestry as a profession and for the future of forests. Certainly there are things we can learn to do better, but if my career's any indication, in my 45 odd years, I've seen a tremendous improvement in our ability to sustain the boreal forest.
Yeah.
And if that trajectory continues, we'll get where we need to get.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. So almost as an accident, we created the right solution. Society pushed us in the right direction. Yeah.
I don't think it was an accident.
Yeah.
I think that I go back to what Dan said about Aldo Leopold, and the first rule of successful tinkering is to keep all the parts.
Right.
I think that we recognized we weren't renewing all the parts.
Yeah.
And, it might not have been entirely conscious, but it wasn't accidental because it was a recognition that we need these other pieces. We need more of this. Mm-hmm. And, our friends in wildlife biology tended to push us that way as well.
Yeah.
Certainly. But I wouldn't say it was planned. But lack of planning doesn't always connote lack of deliberation. Okay. Yeah. So I think we got here on purpose, but we got some nosebleeds and some bruises along the way.
We didn't exactly know how we were going to get here, but we were heading this direction. Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. It makes sense.
I think we learn more over time. I mean, values change, but information gets better, and we get more skilled at what we're doing, and we sort of meander, what we call adaptive management, right? You learn what doesn't work, and you shift. So yeah, we've meandered our way there in many places, and we will continue to do that as we learn more. Where we are now, or what we're thinking, is obviously only good for the next decade, and a decade from now we'll be having a different conversation.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? Hey, like you said, it's not a static landscape; it's always moving, and our understanding of it is always moving and changing. So yeah.
Yeah, and as we all continue to get better and are working across disciplines to make this all happen, what we also have to do is communicate what we're doing with the public better, so that that green line that we're trying to maintain isn't a shifting target, because forests and wildlife habitats take a long time to develop, and
Yeah.
the public doesn't necessarily have that patience or that understanding of that process. And what we don't want to do is get into a planning process across landscapes that is going to take us 50 years to achieve, and then find out that every 5 years the green line is shifting.
Yeah.
and so it's a real challenge for us to work with the public and get buy-in to these landscape objectives that we're all trying to reach together. And I think we have the tools and the wherewithal to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Adding to that, I think one of the places we get into some, I think, serious issues where the public relations go is that there is, from a public policy perspective, in terms of managing forests, you absolutely want and need to have public input at the strategic level, and that is, what are those outcomes going to be, and what is our overall strategy to get there. But when you start talking about forestry, there's this tactical level, right, where you're out there actually making roads and moving trees and doing a wide variety of things that people find maybe less acceptable at the tactical level.
Mhm.
Many of the problems that we have with public relations of forestry is that the public gets involved at the tactical level,
Yeah.
and
Good
in
point.
terms of
Good
what they
point.
like and don't like. And I guess that's all well and good, but when you're trying to manage a landscape over decades and centuries, it makes it very difficult for any professional forest managers to be successful if they're if they're constantly intervening in the tactical techniques, the approaches and operations that forest managers are using, when everybody's always already agreed on what the strategic objective is.
That's
And
awesome.
if we can
I love that.
if we can somehow find a way to elevate the public input at the strategic level, a lot of this conflict, I think, can be resolved.
That's an excellent point, Bob. I really appreciate the way you put that. Actually, it's like, you're right. Most of the concern from the public is the tactical perspective, and that's a great way to put it. So it's not the outcomes that they're upset with. They're upset with how we decided to do it, the perceived problems with that. So that's great. I like that. So I guess with this whole conversation, we've kind of wrapped ourselves around here a bit, but it's what I've come out of this is be thankful. We've learned a lot. We're continuing to learn. We're coming a long way. We don't exactly know where we're going, but we have our sight on the horizon. We know that we want to go in a specific direction regarding increasing sustainability, including more values, and that if we continue to work towards that directive, that we'll get there, right? That outcome-based approach, right? Just focusing on that outcome and making sure that we can continue to pump that outcome out
and communicate it.
And communicate it, right? That's the other thing, right? Is the communications aspect of it. So yeah, it's interesting having these conversations, hey, because you don't know what's going to happen, where you're going to go. I came into this hoping that we could describe what we want as a future forest, and of course, the answer is we don't friggin' know. Like we don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell what the future is going to be, but we know that if we can continue to include more values and continue to increase the knowledge, that we will head in the right direction. And yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. I think we're going to figure this thing out. So I want to appreciate all you guys for coming on. This has been a really interesting conversation. Didn't know where we were going to go, and it went to a good place. So thanks a lot, Bob, Dan, Milo, for taking the time to come on and do this. Yeah, more conversations to come, I guess. So thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, my pleasure, Matt. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to do this. It's been great having a conversation, even virtually, with Milo and Dan again. So great way to get us all together in different parts of the country.
Yeah, no, for sure. I didn't know how it was going to work out, but it worked out well. So perfect. I think we're done. Unless someone else has something else they want to add.
I just want to say, Matt, thank you for today.
Yeah, thanks.
And I really appreciated the conversation with Dan and Bob. I always appreciate conversations with Bob, more so though when we've got a bottle of Craigenmore between us.
We could have figured that out. I think we could have drank separately.
Here on the Craigenmore.
But one thing I've got to say, Matt, thank you for taking the initiative to create Your Forest podcast.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your commitment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It means a lot coming from you. It's been fun. I started as a selfish ploy to learn more and turned into something else. So yeah, I appreciate that. It means a lot. Thanks a lot, Milo. So thanks a lot, guys.
And thank you, Matt, for the invite. And Milo, it was great to get to know you through this podcast. And I always learn from my interactions with foresters. And Bob and Milo, thanks again for some education today. And I think that's what keeps us all credible and realistic, is talking across disciplines. And this was great fun. So thank you very much.
This is awesome, guys. Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. More to come. Next episode is going to be with Milo. The one after that is going to be with Dan, talking more about this subject of engaging the public and how do we make sure that we're managing the forest for all values for everybody forever. Blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? So thanks a lot, guys. Make sure to rate and review, tell a friend, share it on social media. You can listen to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts. Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. We'll catch you next time. Take it easy.